we're not able to influence the world because that's all our attention is taken up on those little things. Do you think unbelievers would be confused about what Christianity really is?
Oh my goodness.
Why? Because we're not waving the banner of what is essential Christianity and what is not. And they say, well, I don't like Christianity because they preach too long, or because I don't like the music, or because this, that, and the other. And we've made these things essential when in fact they're really not.
Matt,
Yes, sir.
when I was raised up is in a fundamental Baptist church, and I don't know if you've heard of shouting, I guess.
Yes, I've heard of, yeah.
Well, you know, I was just a kid, and I was a Christian, but I would think, am I a Christian? Because I don't feel like that.
Very interesting.
I mean, it's like you're about being confused.
Yeah.
But there were some, and they were godly women. I mean, they would get up and they just make a big old racket.
Right. So you're saying it's not just confusing the unbelievers, it's confusing us. I mean, we're thinking our kids.
Well, the tongues movement has so confused people.
That's right.
In churches, because people started thinking, well, I don't speak in tongues. Not me. I never thought that. I want y'all to know that. No.
The tongues movement divided churches.
It divided churches.
Exactly.
And its music is doing the same thing.
That's right.
On a lot of the music.
Where they were speaking in tongues. Yeah. I mean, I have been in a church, but it's really confused people to say, well, I must not really be a Christian because I can't speak in tongues, or I can't pick up snakes and
right.
poison.
I am not going to that church, I'm telling you. Yes, no, I'm not a snake. You know what? If a church is going to split, it should do so because some crazy person says, you know, I don't think, you know, this Trinity thing is, I don't think that's an essential of the faith. And he takes his little group with him, and we say, no, I'm sorry, that is essential. And we will split over that issue. We will split over whether Christ were literally, physically raised from the dead, or just spiritually raised in our heart, as many people said at the turn of the last century. We will split over some of those issues.
That's the Jehovah's.
You know, other issues, speaking in tongues, these other things, we need to clarify what a church believes, and we need to make sure that it's not causing too much dissension. But I don't think that's worth splitting over, like Christianity has. And then there's syncretism. You probably know what syncretism is, the combination of Christianity with some other religion or something else. And I've actually been in a lot of really fascinating discussions with some of you. Larry and I have kind of an ongoing discussion, and Martha and I have been talking about this a lot. When the church becomes too much like the world, and we combine the American dream with the Christian. You know, this is what Christians believe in, the American dream that God blesses. What's that? Prosperity. Like a prosperity gospel or something like that. Exactly. And we confuse, because we don't have the essentials, we confuse cultural ideals with Christian ideals. And that's essentially, that has happened quite a bit. So we've looked at a couple texts about what the common faith is, and we're gonna go back to Scripture frequently, but I did want to take a little bit of time and do some church history with you. So, and we won't get through all this evening. We won't get through everything on the sheet, so bring us back with you next week. But let's start at the very beginning of church history, and what we really want to do is highlight four different phases, four key times. Do I have this? Yeah, I do. 4 key cycles in church history where there was an important moment where they had to define doctrine and practice. We've got the first 2 on here, and we'll deal with the next 2 probably next week or the week after that. But these are key moments when, for one reason or another, Christians had to come together and say, okay, who are we? What do we really believe? All kinds of junk has gummed up the works. What is Christianity, essentially? And these 4 moments, at the early apostolic church, the creeds of the 300s and 400s, the Reformation movement in the 15 and 1600s, and then fundamentalism of the early 1900s. Ooh, fundamentalism. That's a bad word, isn't it? Well, not the way we're going to use it. We're going to use it in a good way. It was a very positive movement, and we enjoy traces of what happened in the early 1900s. We enjoy that even today. So And what we're going to find as we go through some of this church history is we're going to find cycles. We're going to find cycles. In fact, I list those for you on your fourth bullet point on the introduction. Christian history cycles between crystallization of doctrine and practice, and that's what some of these in the apostolic period, when there were creeds, this was the crystallization of doctrine and practice. And then you have stabilization after that, where you kind of go along, we say, okay, we've crystallized doctrine and practice, now we're just kind of riding on those coattails for a little while we're dealing with other difficulties, and then you have full-fledged opposition. Sometimes that opposition is from within the church, sometimes it's external to the church, some of that opposition is physical, as in persecutions or wars, sometimes it's intellectual, as in opposition to our ideas, and we're going to see that actually the more we go through history, the more we're going to see that the opposition is intellectual opposition and less physical opposition. So, does that make sense? This is how we're going to do this.
I don't understand the term crystallization.
Okay, good. Crystallization, meaning when people had to sit there and figure out and solidify.
Okay.
Consensus.
Okay, yeah, there was always a consensus, and that's a fascinating issue too. In all of these periods, there is tremendous Christian consensus. At times when there were denominations, there was cross-denominational consensus. But they sat down and they crystallized. I'm thinking about something kind of hardening and forming. I don't know, is there a better word?
Rock candy is all I can think of when you say that.
Yeah, I love rock candy. But how something kind of forms and hardens, and then we leave this period saying, okay, now we have a better sense of who we are as Christians because of these difficulties we've gone through. And that's what I mean by crystallization, the solidification of certain beliefs and practices.
Be like the foundational part of it, that you've got the rocks and the mortar, and you've got the rebar and all these things building the foundation before you can build on the building?
Sure, if we want to put it in those terms, yeah, it's like the crystallization period is like reestablishing the foundation. Okay. Stabilization is then building on that foundation.
Okay, I get it.
And then, guess what? Someone starts bombarding our building and knocking stuff down and causing all kinds of chaos and problems, and we have to go back to the foundation. Okay. And from a doctrinal and practical standpoint, we kind of have to relay the foundation and reorganize and say, okay, let's go back and make sure we really understand what it means to be Christian based on biblical standards.
Interesting.
This is an exercise that is absolutely crucial for today, and I don't really know where we are in the modern cycle. I don't know if I kind of think we're still in crystallization, in stabilization, but we're getting a lot of new kinds of opposition from outside and from within as well. And you know, the next stage is a new sense of crystallization, going back and saying, what are the foundations of our faith? What are the basic essentials of our faith? Let's rally around those things and not get caught up in all the other stuff. Okay. So we'll illustrate this as we go through some church history. Let's go through cycle 1 here. I'm just calling it the Apostolic Church, and that's the first cycle there. 0, here's your 0 or 3380 or whatever you want to do, all the way through about 300. I'm just kind of using round numbers here. And I'm going to say crystallization in this period is obviously, I mean, this is the clearest crystallization period because it is the ministry of Jesus and it is the apostolic writings, better known as the New Testament. Keep in mind that Jesus didn't write anything. He passed his teachings on to his disciples. His disciples wrote things, and all of those things agreed with one another. There might be different emphases for different writers to different audiences, but everything that Jesus' disciples said agrees with each other. Okay, so there was a sense of where we are bringing the truth of God's whole, entire redemptive plan together. This is what it is according to Jesus, according to the New Testament apostles. And remember, going back to those verses, it's interesting that Paul was not talking about, hold fast to the traditions of Jesus. What did he say?
Traditions I've taught.
He says our traditions, meaning the apostles' traditions, as the apostles have in a unified manner, how we have passed these things on to you, and then that generation passed them on to the next generation. So the writing of the New Testament itself was a form of doctrinal crystallization. And we're going to kind of extend that out to about 100 AD, depending on where John puts his pen down after writing Revelation, maybe 90, maybe 90 AD, just using round figures here. So crystallization is the ministry of Jesus, the apostolic New Testament writings. The nice thing about this phase is that these are inspired writings, these are inerrant writings, they are completely authoritative. They carry an inspiration and authority that further crystallization periods don't have inherently. They have when they are referring back to the New Testament documents. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to the next period. So after that, there's some stabilization. You have the next generation of people from 100 to 200 AD. There's a group of people called fathers and apologists. There are all kinds of external misunderstandings about Christianity. There are people in Rome who are wondering, who call Christians cannibals. Why do they call Christians cannibals? Because they eat flesh and drink blood. And so the early church fathers say, no, you got to understand what we're doing. It has nothing to do with that. And imagine you're in Rome and you hear about these people in the Jewish area, and they're doing this, and then it's catching on and going all over the place. There has to be teaching, proper teaching, but there also has to be apologetics, a defense of what is going on. So we have in that second century, 100 to 200, we have fathers and apologists in light of these external misunderstandings as well as internal heresies that are starting to root at the surface. It became necessary to clarify, which is what fathers did, or defend, which is what the apologists did. It became necessary to clarify and defend apostolic faith. Yeah, there were, by the way, around this time, there were some minor persecutions. There was some growing antagonism toward Christianity, but this was fairly local. It would, like Nero's persecution of Christians was just in Rome. And it was pretty bad, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like a widespread thing. So there was opposition during this time. I don't want to minimize that. But it was not widespread as it would become later on. So we have fathers, you've probably heard of some of these names, Clement, Polycarp. They called believers to doctrinal unity. And this is what they're calling them. They're saying we need to unify around the essentials. And they're calling their people to moral purity. Unfortunately, what you have is a lot of, we'll get to that in a minute. And then you have apologists such as Ignatius, Tertullian, Tatian, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, who write against Marcionism, Gnosticism, other early heresies. Some of these guys died for what they believe. Justin Martyr, he is being taken to where he is in Asia Minor. He's being taken by Roman legions, or a group of Roman soldiers. He's being taken to Rome, and along the way, he's writing letters to the churches that he has ministered to about sticking with the faith, about defending themselves against heresy, and he's offering defense for Christianity. So these guys, many of them paid the ultimate price for providing some stability to Christianity. And then, I'm just kind of going to the next section here, then the opposition cranks up. By the time we're in the second, in the 200 to 300 year period, you have more heresies and persecutions. Heresies matured. This is on your worksheet here, the third bullet point under cycle number 1. Heresies matured. They gained traction in the early Christian communities. Flip over to the chart on the back real quickly. I just give you a little, we're not going to go through this bit by bit, but you have a whole line. These are just some. This is just a handful of the more popular heresies that was plaguing early Christianity. One individual said the rapid growth of the church brought to it people of various religious backgrounds, and this in turn gave rise to diverse interpretations of Christianity. So what's happening here, as Christianity expands, someone says, hey, that reminds me of my, tribal pagan whatever that I grew up with, and maybe I could just merge the two, and then everything would work out fine.
That is going on right now.